I'm quite sure I'm not a great novelist, because I've only got down onto paper really three types of people. The person I think I am, the people who irritate me, and the people I'd like to be.
Edward Morgan Forster, known to his friends as Morgan, but to the public as E.M. Forster, was born on the 1st of January 1879 in Marylebone, London.
He's born into a Victorian world, and he's marooned with his mother very early from his father's death before he was 2.
He was educated at Tunbridge School in Kent.
And he hates it. He hates public school life.
And then King's College, Cambridge.
Where, of course, he was blissful. And then he began to realise that he was, as we would now call it, gay, but he would have called it, in his mind, other, and that he would never have the conventional life of 9-to-5 work and marriage and children.
He went on to become one of England's most respected and loved novelists, writing, among other titles, Howard's End and A Passage to India. He was also a short story writer, an essayist, a biographer, and a librettist.
It was Cambridge that first set me off writing. And in this very room where I now am, there was at one time my tutor, a man called Wed, and it was he who suggested to me I might write. He did it in the most informal way. He said in a sort of drawling voice, I really don't see why you shouldn't write.
But I remember him once ticking me off for writing him rather bad letters. I'm not a writer at all, and he told me that this was silly, that whenever I picked up my pen, it suddenly became awkward and I became a different person, and he said I mustn't do this, and explained that all you have to do is you pick up your pen and you write what you think, which he certainly succeeded in doing, but I never did.
As you know, his father died when he was young. He wasn't yet 2. And he lived in a very close relationship with his mother and claimed to have been unhappy at school, but actually there's no evidence. It was a retrospective unhappiness.
He had a lot of aunts, and so he has all of these elderly ladies who have shaped his life, including the most important one aside from his mother, Mary Ann Thornton, who, when she dies, leaves him a great legacy of £8,000 that liberates him.
And as a result of that, he can go to Cambridge, and he can also sort of dither about and figure out who he is and write for a living.
He wrote only 6 novels, 5 of which were published during his lifetime. The 6th, completed in 1914, Morris, remained hidden away until the change in the law on homosexuality in 1967. It was eventually published after Forster's death in 1971.
And anyone who's cared to read my books will see what a high value I attach to personal relationships and to tolerance.
I think tolerance was easy to him. I think it was upsetting because he was upset by things that happened in the world. I think very much so, possibly from the distance of Cambridge. I don't know. But I remember very well him getting very upset and angry about America's foreign policy, for instance, which he detested. And indeed, he wouldn't allow his books to be filmed because it would almost inevitably involve American money, and he certainly didn't want that sort of invasion. He wanted to hold back as much as possible. And in fact, the American ambassador was asked to dinner at high table one evening by the provost, and Morgan told me that he wasn't going to go.
His novels are known throughout the world. But if you haven't read them, you'll probably have seen a film or television adaptation of at least one of them.
During Forster's lifetime, he would not allow any of his novels to be made into films, and a lot of people had tried, but he never agreed. And then after he died, we decided we wanted to try and make A Room with a View, and so we were actually invited up to King's College to meet the executors, and so Ismail and I went to Cambridge, and what they wanted to see us about was our making a Passage to India, which had not been made at that point. And we said, well, that'd be wonderful, but at that very moment, playing in theaters in London was heat and dust. And we didn't want to make another British Raj movie of that kind. We wanted to make A Room with a View. And the executors at King's College weren't all that pleased. And they said, why would you want to make that little novel? And I mean, when you could have Passage to India, why do you want to do that little book? Yes, it's pleasant and nice. And we said, well, we just do. That's what we want to do.
Turn over.
A Passage to India did get made, not by Merchant Ivory, but by David Lean.
And playback.
Forster mistrusted movie makers. The film rights were only sold after his death. Lean then spent 18 months writing his script and had to be vetted by the guardians of Forster's masterpiece, the Fellows of King's College, Cambridge.
I did the script, and they were very polite, and they asked me to come along after having read it for lunch. And I was just about to start on the fish, and they started in on me, and I said, I'd wish you'd waited till the sweet. And they were very, very nice indeed. And after about 2 hours, they were very kind and just gave it their blessing.
Well, Forster's one of the very few Englishmen that understood Indians, and it was this deep understanding of Indians that made him write a book that was able to delve into the psyche, the Indian psyche, as it were.
I wouldn't be ashamed for Forster to read the script. I think I stuck with his characters, and on the whole, given the limitations of time, I mean, what's one doing? One's doing something in 2 hours, book that thick.
But there is one of his novels you might not have heard of, The Longest Journey, written in 1907 when Morgan was in his late 20s. A semi-autobiographical novel that sets out clearly the premonitions that Forster had about the future of his own life.
The longest journey for him was the journey to being a fully developed adult. And The Longest Journey, the book, is very much a young man's book. It's about how a child grows up to become a man. So the opening scene...
The cow is there, said Ansel, lighting a match and holding it out over the carpet. No one spoke. He waited till the end of the match fell off. Then he said again, she is there, the cow, there, now. You have not proved it, said a voice. I have proved it to myself.
Which is so wonderful, and actually in some ways the best scene in the book, when you have the undergraduates at Cambridge talking about whether the cows exist if you can't see them, is a parable of what is life going to become. Now for Forster, life should have been uncivilized, it should have been primitive, it should have been everything that his life wasn't. To me, The Longest Journey is a book about civilized values, in other words, uncivilized values. And the journey is, will we ever achieve that? And the answer is no.
All his early novels were dealing primarily with heterosexual relationships, although there are very intense friendships between men, you know, as indeed there were and are in life. The sort of relationships that critics describe now as homosocial relationships, these sort of very intense male bonds that happen within institutions like universities, particularly Cambridge, when there are only men taking degrees in those days. So in The Longest Journey, you have the scene with the university friends, which is incredibly intimate.
I like best one that's not very popular, perhaps called The Longest Journey. I think there I got nearer to putting down what I'd got inside me and wanted to say.
In The Longest Journey, which Forster thought of as his most autobiographical novel, I think, it was the one he felt closest to and said he liked most, and people have read it very autobiographically. The central character in that, Ricky Elliott, has a terribly sad life where he really gets diverted from what seems to be his true calling, which is to write. And it seems typical of Forster's suggesting that people get sort of distracted in their life from what's important to them.
And I think when an author has been as popular as Forster first started out as, and then as he became with Howard's End, and then years later with A Passage to India, this secret little book almost was what gave him the most pleasure. It wasn't written for an audience. It had really rarely found an audience.
The Longest Journey is a painful elaboration of the undeveloped heart in the process of developing. And then we see its gradual development over the next 4 novels, this undeveloped English heart. And absolutely, there's this tremendous sense of truthfulness and sincerity. And perhaps because he did not have a conventional family, that he invested so much in his friends. His famous saying that he'd put his friend before his country.
Forster wrote, "I hate the idea of causes, and if I had to choose between betraying my country and betraying my friend, I hope I should have the guts to betray my country." It's an important quotation, isn't it? And I think one that we do well to remember nowadays. And it's also to remember, important to remember Forster's stand on, how relationships between people are more important than that.
On one hand, it goes back to early 20th century ideas of friendship, very much prevalent in Cambridge. At the same time, it also, I think, satisfies a certain lack in him because of his essential loneliness. And that's very much there in The Longest Journey. You say that Forster's long journey, it can also be Forster's lonely journey.
It was very clear that it had been autobiographical, set at Cambridge and with the same kinds of camaraderie that he had had there. And it was a memorial, really, to his own life and to this high point of his past, because it then became a memorial to, one, his hopes, the other to his fears, and I think to a lost world that when he was involved in it in 1907, when he published the novel, he was of two minds about it. I mean, the glory of Cambridge and the miniature world that he thought it was. And then he was torn by the growing realization several years after having left Cambridge that in fact this fantasy of Cambridge as a world in miniature was actually completely an illusion. He couldn't take his place in the world that was meant for a Cambridge man, and that he had fit in so well at Cambridge, but the rest of his life, with his burgeoning sense of homosexuality, was not going to fit in to the world. He sees friends like Hugh Meredith, the first person he really was in love with and seems to have had some kind of erotic fumbling with, although what it was not clear. Hugh Meredith marries, has children. All these people around him are leading conventional lives. However much their camaraderie was strong at Cambridge, and he sees that he can't do that. And so I think the autobiographical element is a kind of prophecy of failure, of not fitting in.
He would always be an outsider. He'd always be left field. And that must have been very painful for any young man. I mean, it's fine nowadays. Nobody cares. But then people wanted to conform. I mean, the public school ethos was that you conformed. It's a book about unconformity, not non-conformity, but unconformity. And it's about Ricky being unhappy in his own skin.
He doesn't see that within about 15 years, I think, from the time he graduates Cambridge, he will find a new set of friends, some from Bloomsbury, but then also a whole set of gay men with whom he can feel more himself. And he never quite leads a completely happy life. I mean, one of the touching things in The Longest Journey is the point at which he describes the love of a man and a woman, really, who find each other in life and know that they are right for one another and that they're going to go through the longest journey locked in one another's arms. And he soon realizes that that's not for him. It's not going to happen. But even once he becomes a happy gay man in the later 20s and then into the 30s, even the men to whom he does become attached are also attached elsewhere.
You could say Ricky and Forster are one. it's a cliche to say this, but the fact that Ricky was lame is an image of what Forster had by then discovered about himself, that he was gay.
The lameness of Ricky Elliott is in some way, well, it's an inherited condition. And so I think the idea of the inherited flaw and the fear of passing it on pushes the people in the main characters, Ricky in The Longest Journey, into a series of unhappy relationships that are really compromises with what his inner being perhaps is telling him to do. I think if you fear that this is something that you will pass on, even if you're not going to procreate and have children, perhaps it's something you fear letting out into the world. It's also a great falling off from the kind of camaraderie of Cambridge, where this was not seen as a personal failing or as a kind of elemental failing. You're not fearing to pass this on because you live in this miniature world in which all of this is fine. And so as soon as you leave this world, this protected world, you're thrown up against the fact that the real world doesn't necessarily have a place either for the intellectual or the homosexual or the creative person, that you really have to fit in somewhere differently.
I should say immediately that it's quite difficult reading The Longest Journey now, because you have to read it in the context of being gay, not just being completely impossible, to be despised. It was, after all, when he wrote it, it was only 20 years after the Oscar Wilde trial, but actually illegal. You would have gone to prison. So it's very hard for us now, post the 60s, to read the novel in the same way. So you have to have a lot of imagination and read it as it was written in 1907.
And when you think about the prophetic nature of the autobiography in The Longest Journey, what's remarkable is that it's not exactly what happens to Ricky Elliott, but Forster, too, becomes a tutor. He tutors Latin for Syed Ross Massoud, who becomes one of the mainstays of his life, this Indian man who is in England, who comes to him seeking Latin lessons. And it becomes a very different kind of friendship.
I think the thing about Massoud that's so wonderful is that Forster thinks that being gay is this terrible secret that he finally reveals to Massoud. And Massoud says, I know. But it doesn't make any difference to him. It doesn't have the same valence for him. And it's just not of interest to Massoud, right? And so once Massoud says, we'll be great friends, it's fine. And so I think it's layers and layers of understanding what human intimacy could be.
But even in small ways, that's a kind of fulfillment of the humdrum that he fears, the decline from what Ricky Elliott's promise had been. And then during World War I, he takes on mundane tasks. He goes to work in the National Gallery, and then he also then goes to Alexandria to work for the Red Cross.
And it's when he first sees the soldiers all sort of unconsciously bathing on the beach that he has his first great revelation, and that's where he has his first sexual experience too. He's almost 40, so that's quite belated, not just by contemporary standards, but he felt related as well.
He writes quite explicitly in both his diaries and in letters to friends. In one such letter to George Barger's wife, Florence,
it's to her that he first writes about losing his virginity at the age of 37 in Egypt, what he calls, in his letters to her, parting with respectability.
Yesterday, for the first time in my life, I parted with respectability. I have felt the step would be taken for many months. I've tried to take it before. It has left me curiously sad.
Because he keeps using that phrase, parted with parting with respectability. One, from the first time he has sex on a beach in Egypt with an unknown man, to other times that he has sex. So it becomes a kind of wonderful code word.
And while still in Egypt, he meets Mohammed El Adel.
They meet on the tram. Mohammed's a tram conductor. And like most of the Forster encounters that are really wonderful and surprising and human, it comes with a series of mistakes and misapprehensions and potential humiliations that sort of blossom into real friendship. And then gradually, as he is invited into Muhammad's living space and then invited to sort of be beside him on the bed, he opens the possibility that it would be a sexual relationship. And Muhammad is neither repelled nor particularly, I think, attracted by that. I don't think he thought of himself as gay particularly, but he really did admire Forster and love him, and this was sort of something that his love wanted, and so he went along with it. And it was revelatory for Forster, I think, in a lot of ways. Like most Egyptian men, Muhammad marries and has children and names his eldest son after Forster. They're separated by the fact that Muhammad is conscripted into military service. And then when Forster comes back, he discovers that El Adel has tuberculosis and is dying. And he stays with him. He nurses him in his final illness, and he stays with him, sleeps on the floor. It actually reads a lot like the AIDS epidemic in certain kinds of ways, the kind of tenderness and care and hopelessness of the final weeks of Muhammad's life. And Forster has to go back, so he leaves before Muhammad dies. He doesn't see him die. When he gets back to England, because of the way the post works, he ends up with these sort of ghostly posthumous letters. By the time he gets Muhammad's final letters, which are at King's, he knows that he's already dead. And those are extremely poignant and powerful. Muhammad ends the last letter, "My love to you, my love to you, my love to you." It's sort of almost, Keatsian, beyond the grave kind of feeling.
She obeyed and crept into his arms. Only this time, her grasp was the stronger. Her heart beat louder and louder as the sound of his grew more faint. He was crying like a little frightened child, and her lips were wet with his tears.
And in fact, in something like Longest Journey, I think he's actually experimenting well before he's lived his life with the prospects of what his future life might be. So when he has this strong identification with Ricky Elliott, and when Ricky marries, I think in important ways he's thinking through, should I marry? And this is in the context, first of all, of most of his Cambridge friends by that time sort of settling off domestically into marriages. He tries it out in fiction, and he's not hard on Agnes, actually. I think Agnes is not the villain there. And he discovers that it would be a terrible thing to do. So it's as if in working through in his imagination, he can work through possibilities.
Well, Forster had made the decision, or subconsciously made the decision, not to do what so many of his friends did, which was marry their friends' sisters. He was always going to be, as we used to call it, a confirmed bachelor.
Forster's often seen as an iconic liberal figure, and I think that has a lot to do with his involvement with the Bloomsbury Group. And what Bloomsbury, I think, particularly stood for was a kind of freedom and experiment, partly freedom and experiment in art, trying to think of new ways of writing novels or poems, or new ways of doing philosophy, new ways of painting, but also new ways of living, trying to live, free of some of the class prejudices and other prejudices. They didn't always succeed, of course, but they were certainly very frank about sexuality.
He writes an essay also about his Uncle Willie in the early 20s. These are essays written for the Memoir Club, the Bloomsbury Memoir Club, a group of Bloomsbury figures, Forster, Virginia Woolf, Leonard Woolf, Maynard Keynes, other people, Lytton Strachey, who get together and write essays about their lives, and they strive to be as open and as honest as they can be. And so this is also another venue, another place in which Forster is writing very frankly about sexuality. He is out, as we would call it, to all of these people. So in this memoir that he writes for the Memoir Club about his uncle Willie, he quotes a letter that Willie wrote to another member of the family, worrying that Morgan, surrounded by all of these elderly ladies, is developing what Willie calls Austenish airs.
But his favorite novelist was Jane Austen, the most conventional bourgeois heterosexual novelist. So we cannot just chart Forster on a gay axis. When he's writing it, that's where he learns his craft. So there is life, but there is also literature.
Are you going to Howard's End?
Yes.
Why?
Oh, darling,
How are you?
It's such a lovely surprise. I'm fit as a fiddle. Do you remember Miss Schneekopf?
Oh, yes, thank you, Sister Helen. It's the Crescent Car in Yorkshire.
dear.
Riding the horse and I have some foolish... But we must go home. You can't go to Howard's End. Not. It's 10 to 5.
Well, Miss Schlegel, I'm afraid our little outing is going to have to be another day.
Listen, thank you. There's a German expression for that, I believe, Miss Schlegel.
Ist aufgeschoben, ist nicht aufgehoben.
Yeah, not cancelled, but postponed.
Postponed.
Howard's End, to me, is a very, very profound book. It's the great novel about London. It's great about, as he says, only connect, personal relationships.
Only connect. That was the whole of her sermon. Only connect the prose and the passion, and both will be exalted, and human love will be seen at its height. Live in fragments no longer. Only connect. And the beast and the monk, robbed of the isolation that is life to either, will die.
I suppose the most famous phrase of Forster's is the phrase "only connect," that he used as an epigraph for Howard's End, his novel of 1910. And what that seems to speak to is a lot of important things in his work, I think, but particularly a sense that people aren't connecting with each other, that there's something to do with the way they're living, particularly in England and particularly in the middle classes, that isn't right, that they're not engaging with each other, not really relating to each other.
And there was a scene in which was, surrounded, it had these words in it, and it was the sort of only connect scene. So when we were doing it, we were really conscious that this was, the important scene. And it was cut.
And everyone said, "Oh, why do we not hear that famous line about only connecting?" And it was never said. It was not something you could say. It was, he could say it, Forster could say it as an author and talk about connecting or not connecting, but it was nothing really that you could put in the mouths of our actresses who were wandering around in a field at that moment. So.
He's quite a wonderful writer, and so wonderful at writing women's characters, of which, there are very few, or just characters, full stop, but particularly women's characters, and and getting inside that psychology, he was brilliant at.
What Forster said after he'd written Howard's End in 1910, he spoke of the weariness of the only subject that I both can and may treat, the love of men for women, and vice versa. And it's a very odd statement, that, I think, isn't it? Partly because it's not clear what the can and the may are saying. I mean, is it that he has the technical facility to write about love between men and women, but he doesn't really feel like writing about that anymore? As when you say I may or I may not do something, or is he saying that it's the only subject that he is allowed to write about, that social conventions, the literary conventions of the day, the legal conventions too, will permit?
It is a world of Jane Austen. Man meets girl, they get married, but it's regularly invaded by what I would call Laurentian impulses, that the man actually is attracted to his wife's previous partner. That suddenly that previous boyfriend dies. Nothing like that would happen in Austen.
The Longest Journey is Laurentian. It's writing about all the things that Lawrence wrote about before Lawrence did. It's about the primitive, deeper side of all of us, which suburbia suppresses, and that Ricky never experienced apart from fleetingly.
I think what happened to him was that once he'd discovered his sexuality or sort of come to terms with it, he was, very excited by it and determined to live it to the fullest, and he really did, with very attractive and exciting lovers, and he was very happy writing about his physical encounters in the famous Locked Diary, which no one was allowed to see.
One of the things is called the Locked Diary, and it's because it describes a fairly large leather-bound book with a lock and a hasp and a key, in which he kept a diary for a good bit of his life, and including a subsection which he labeled a sex diary, so that once he begins to actually have sex and think about sex in a particular way, he sort of quarries out a separate section of the book to pick up and record those intimate thoughts which are to do with his sexuality and his sexual activity.
He wrote a lot of erotic short stories for his own pleasure. He writes about this in his diaries too. And in 1922, he's had a very difficult time for over a decade between the time he publishes Howard's End and is working on a passage to India, but not making very good progress. He, on the side, writes Morris, which is a kind of fantasy, a fulfillment of a fantasy of a sexual relationship, a very frank one that he dedicates to what he calls a happier year, as if he can see that this kind of relationship, a happy relationship between two men, is possible, but it will happen at some future time. So he's willing to write about sexuality, even when he's not willing to publish it. But in 1922, he looks at this pile of erotic stories that he has written over the years, and he burns them. Now, not because he writes in his diary he is ashamed of them for their contents, but because they've created a wrong channel for his pen, and they've blocked him artistically, he thinks, from somehow continuing his progress on a passage with the novel that becomes A Passage to India. But he doesn't burn all of his stories because he keeps Morris.
But he didn't publish it. He couldn't publish it at the time because it would have been charged with indecency and could have got him sent to prison. But even after homosexuality was decriminalised, he still didn't publish it, and he was criticised much later in life for not doing that. It was only after his death that Morris was published and then filmed.
And when I reread Morris, I thought, this is still a very relevant kind of story. And in a way, it was the reverse of the coin of A Room with a View, because it was, again, about young people who were living a kind of muddled lie of their lives. And I thought, this is something we could make. I knew people in New York, and not only New York, and also in England, who were in the same sort of predicament as Morris's characters. They were, they couldn't really face up to their feelings. They were obviously queer, but they had to live a lie. And I thought this would have some meaning for people now.
Dearest Florence, R has been parted with, and in the simplest, most inevitable way. I am so happy. Not the actual pleasure, but because the last barrier has fallen. I wish I was writing the latter half of Morris now. I know so much more. It is awful to know of the thousands who go through youth without ever knowing. I have known in a way before, but never like this. My luck has been amazing.
And once he burns these stories, he begins another series of them, which were also published posthumously, as Morris was. One of them is called The Life to Come, and it too is a story of an erotic relationship between two men.
Once he writes Passage to India, in a way it's a coming of age, and I think he said somewhere that he cannot bear to write anymore. He realized that he was not writing what he wanted to write within the structure of the standard heterosexual novel, which is the only way novel ends, with marriage or with birth. And as a result, he rejects the novel form.
Somehow I dried up after the passage. I wanted to write, but didn't want to write novels. And that's really too long a story. But I think one of the reasons why I stopped writing novels is that the social aspect of the world changed so very much. I'd been accustomed to write about the old, vanished world with its homes and its family life and its comparative peace. All that went. And though I can think about it, I cannot put it into fiction form.
And he goes to short stories. You have something like The Other Boat, which not only celebrates same-sex love, but this sadomasochistic frenzy in the boat and cross-racial kind of sexual encounter in the boat between Coco, the Eurasian boy, and the Englishman who's going to India to get married, and suddenly it erupts. So I think he thinks of the short story form as a more democratic form, as opposed to the compulsory heterosexuality of the novel.
One of the strange things about Forster's career is that it really splits into two very different halves. The novels were all written when he was fairly young, and rather bizarrely for someone who was so talented and so successful as a novelist, he simply stopped writing them after 1924. And the last novel, Passage to India, he'd started a decade earlier than that even, although he'd had trouble finishing it.
And at the end of A Passage to India, which of course is the last novel he publishes, it's published in 1924, we have these two men, Aziz and Fielding, who have been very close to one another through very difficult periods in each of their lives. And they're riding on horseback.
"Why can't we be friends now?" said the other, holding him affectionately. "It's what I want. It's what you want." But the horses didn't want it. They swerved apart. The earth didn't want it, sending up rocks through which riders must pass single file. No, not yet. And the sky said, no, not there.
And the answer in Passage to India is not now. Not now. And I find that very moving, because it's a very powerful thing to want friendship and to know that the social and political constraints will not make it possible. Not now. And in that sense, I think it's also, that's tied to his sexuality. I think he always has a sense that there's going to be a possible time in the future where the stigma and the self-repression and the criminalization and the hatred of homosexuals, or of thinking about homosexuality, as he says, of the public having to think about it, will not have the same malign power that it does in his lifetime.
After that, though, he became a much more public figure, and it's, I think, in his public figure phase that he becomes much more a kind of spokesman for liberalism and often making important public stands on issues of the day. He appeared in the trial of Radcliffe Hall's The Well of Loneliness, for example, in 1928, trying to defend that novel against the charge of obscenity.
He does not object to the writing frankly about sexuality. In fact, he thinks it's important. And so he's one of the key witnesses in the 1960 trial, Penguin Books, and the publication of Lady Chatterley's Lover, and he offers a very spirited defense of Lawrence. And by that point, Forster is so eminent a figure that it really means a great deal that Forster is lending his personal prestige to defending Lawrence, whom he thinks is one of the great imaginative novelists of the 20th century.
I think that in his early period of creation, he felt himself, because of his own sexual tastes and beliefs, a very isolated, in some ways threatened person. At the time of A Passage to India, he moves into a circle of friends, of like-minded human beings, profoundly in sympathy with him. And it's at least conceivable that something of the spur of anxiety, and the spur of mutiny against his background begins being less important at that time.
He has feared for a long time that his powers of observation as a novelist are failing him. And what's odd is that this comes at the same moment, I don't know how they're related, to the fact that he then has met J.R. Ackerley. He becomes connected to a younger circle of gay men, and he writes plenty of other things. He writes essays, he publishes biographies. I mean, he is completely a productive writer, but he is not a novelist.
And Ackerley has these marvelous parties, which are a mixture of, Oxbridge types and their lovers and police officers and rogues of all sorts. And there's a lot of bubbly and there's a lot of fun, and that's where he meets Bob Buckingham. And it changes his life. It's the great love of his life. And he knows it almost immediately, which is really profound also. Forster knows that Bob has a girlfriend, and at least at the beginning is tolerant of this. And then Forster begins to be in a kind of tug of war with this woman. And it comes to a sort of terrible head. Bob informs Forster that May is pregnant and that they are going to be married at the end of the month. And it's shattering for him. It's very sweet, really, when you think about it, because Bob says to him, "Will you be the witness at the wedding?" And concludes, because he doesn't know very much about Bob and because he doesn't know very much about marriage, that this means that Bob is lost to him. And yet again, another sort of Forsterian surprise, which is that the marriage is more malleable and humane than he could expect. And that's in large measure thanks to May as well, who seems to understand that Forster is a hugely important person in Bob's life and understands that it's a sexual relationship.
And Forster becomes basically part of their family, so that when he is very elderly, Bob and May are the people who are taking care of him.
When Forster had his final stroke, and he was in it at 93, I think, or 92, something, he was in King's, and he'd had a series of little strokes, and then he had a sort of major stroke, and people in the stairway heard him cry out and fall. And he was desperate to get to be with Bob. It was clear he was really very badly affected. His legs didn't work, and he was miserable, but he was terrified of being alone, and he really wanted to be with Bob, and he really wanted to be taken up to Coventry. And it took several days before they could do that, and they sort of scooped him up and took him there. And it was May who stayed beside him the entire time and held his hand. And so he was really in the bosom of this family that had known and loved him all that time. And he died in their house, holding her hand and her keeping him company. And there are wonderful stories about they thought that he was in a coma or unconscious, and so she sort of let go of his hand, and one eye kind of half opened, remonstrating. Didn't have speech, but it was like, "Don't you leave me," and she didn't.
We are talking about different kinds of love, and in a way he thought that love was richer and more replenishing than just lost kind of sexual love. And in some ways maybe his relationship with Buckingham's wife was deeper than his relationship maybe with Buckingham, or equally important. And she also felt so very strongly towards Forster.
So he's found a family that is supportive of him, that he has created around him in a way very different from the total alienation from the idea of family that he had felt in 1907.
So he died, a Victorian death in some ways, right? In the company of the family that he loved, and they were very tender towards him.
I think in many ways he would have thought his life was a blessed life. He was a successful writer, and he did have lovers. Who can say when they've got to the end of their life and they're dying in their lover's wife's arms that it's a happy life? I think it's about as happy as he could have hoped for, actually.
But I'm quite sure of one thing, that his friendship enclosed us all, and we never felt that anything was being taken away from one to give to another. When I saw him just the other day, as it seems, he was, of course, outwardly decrepit. He couldn't walk well, and he was stooped, but he looked basically the same, and he was basically the same. And he was curiously and marvelously accepting what was happening. There was no pathos, nothing at all. He said, "Oh, I hope I'll pop off quickly." When I do, he said. And then he said, "You know, sometimes I feel empty, as if my creative power had come to an end." But he said, "I don't mind." And I said to him, "You know, Morgan, 25 years ago, you once said to me, you said, as I get older, I hope I shan't get depressed." And you thought to yourself for a little and then answered yourself and said, "No, I don't think I shall." And he didn't.
In the 4 novels that I love most, Angel's Room, Howard's End, and A Passage to India, he is saying more about life in the 20th century and about men and women and about how we live our lives. We haven't actually mentioned the word moral. He's an intensely moral novelist, and civilization and values. He's a novelist about values.
I think he changed our notions of good and bad in our society more than any other person on what you might call the liberal side. More even than Russell, more even than Shaw. And he changed them because I think he had a greater sensitivity to the complexities of life and to the complexities of morality. And that is why I think he will live as a great force in our literature.
Forster was a great champion of the individual and the individual's right to live and speak right as he wanted to, and made some really significant kind of interventions in public debates. And I think, you know, he became known as one of the great liberal voices of the age.
There's a huge expression of what queer desire is. There's a huge expression of what straight desire is. And so it's really interesting to see the world come around to Forster well past the time of his death.
Tolerance, good temper, and sympathy are no longer enough in a world which is rent by religious and racial persecution, in a world where ignorance rules, and science, who ought to have ruled, plays the subservient pimp. Tolerance, good temper, and sympathy, they are what matter really, and if the human race is not to collapse, they must come to the front before long.